Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our special 9-year anniversary episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be presenting the second of our first ever 3-part series about the 1954 murder of Marilyn Reese Sheppard. We released part 1 last week, which outlined the most important facts of the case, and if you haven't heard that episode yet, I suggest you go back and listen to it, since I shared a lot of information which will be relevant to what we're discussing today. As a brief recap, 31-year-old Marilyn Reese Sheppard was the wife of a prominent 30-year-old physician named Sam Sheppard. The couple lived in Bay Village, Ohio, a suburb of Cleveland, alongside their 7-year-old son, Sam Sheppard Jr., who went by the nickname Chip, and Marilyn was 4 months pregnant at this time. On the evening of July 3, 1954, the Sheppards hosted a dinner party at their residence with another couple, but since Sam had experienced an exhausting day, he fell asleep on the daybed in the living room before Marilyn went upstairs to sleep in the guest bedroom. However, during the early morning hours of July the 4th, Sam claimed that he was awakened by the sound of his wife screaming, and when he ran into the bedroom, he was knocked unconscious. When Sam woke up, he discovered that Marilyn had been bludgeoned to death in her bed in what appeared to be an attempted sexual assault, and when he looked downstairs, he saw what he described as a quote-unquote bushy-haired intruder in the house. Sam chased this intruder outside onto the beach alongside Lake Erie and got into a scuffle with them, but claimed that he was knocked unconscious again, and when he woke up, his attacker was gone. Well, police did not find Sam's account to be believable and suspected that he killed Marilyn and fabricated his entire story about the intruder. This would evolve into a very sensational case where the local newspapers flat out accused Sam of the murder and publicly pressured the police into arresting him, particularly when they learned that Sam had been carrying on an extramarital affair with a young woman named Susan Hayes, who had worked as a lab technician at his family's hospital. Even though the evidence against Sam was very circumstantial, the police eventually charged him with first-degree murder, and this would lead to what was described as the quote-unquote trial of the century that was attended by media outlets from all over the country. The trial lasted 9 weeks, and on December the 21st, 1954, the jury found Sam guilty of second-degree murder, and he received a sentence of life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 10 years. Well, Sam never stopped maintaining his innocence, and some people felt that even if he was guilty, the evidence was nowhere near strong enough to convict, and the sensationalistic and heavily biased media coverage of the case prevented him from receiving a fair trial. Well, at the end of our last episode, Sam's original defense attorney made a couple of failed attempts to appeal his conviction, and by the time the 1960s rolled around, the case would become much bigger than anyone could have ever imagined, and that's why I believe we need 3 episodes to properly do it justice. So without any further ado, I now present part 2 of our series about the murder of Marilyn Reese Sheppard. So when we last left off, Sam's original defense attorney, Bill Corrigan, was attempting to overturn his conviction without success. Prior to the trial, the defense had hired a forensic expert to perform an analysis of the murder scene, but they were unable to do so because the authorities failed to turn over the keys to the Sheppard residence. After the trial, Corrigan hired the services of noted criminologist Dr. Paul Leland Kirk, who finally did the forensic analysis and published a 19-page report in which he shared his opinion that Sam's account of what happened on the morning of the murder was true, and Marilyn was likely killed by an intruder. But Dr. Kirk's report failed to convince the higher courts to grant Sam a new trial, and he continued to languish in prison, and Corrigan died in July of 1961 at the age of 75. You might recall from our last episode that before Sam was charged with the murder, the Cuyahoga County coroner, Dr. Samuel Gerber, held a public inquest in which he questioned Sam while he was under oath, and Corrigan was not allowed to participate. Critics have always said that Corrigan's biggest mistake was allowing Sam to testify under these circumstances rather than advising him to assert his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. Corrigan also advised Sam to perjure himself by denying the allegations that he was having an extramarital affair, which turned out to be a major setback when the allegations were proven to be true and Susan Hayes testified as a witness at Sam's trial. One reporter would later say that even though Sam was tried for murder, he was essentially convicted of adultery. One of the first media figures to publicly express support for Sam was Paul Holmes, a Chicago Tribune reporter who had covered the trial and felt that Sam was railroaded, particularly after he read Dr. Kirk's report. In 1961, Holmes published a book titled The Sheppard Murder Case, which outlined many of the problems with Sam's conviction and argued that he was innocent. The book was also the first publication to report on some strange occurrences involving a potential alternate suspect named Richard Eberling, but we'll get back to him in a little while. It was Holmes that introduced the Sheppard family to an aspiring defense attorney named F. Lee Bailey, who was living in Rocky River, another suburb of Cleveland. Bailey also came to believe that Sam was wrongly convicted, so he agreed to take on the case pro bono and was officially hired by Sam's brother, Steve Sheppard. Of course, this would jumpstart Bailey's legal career, as he eventually became one of the most famous defense attorneys in the United States, and wound up working with a number of high-profile clients, including the Boston Strangler Albert DeSalvo, Patty Hearst, and O.J. Simpson. Bailey felt that the primary argument in the newest appeals of Sam's conviction should be that he did not receive a fair trial due to the biased coverage the case received from the local media, which may have prejudiced the jury. The most influential figure in this whole affair was Lewis B. Seltzer, the editor-in-chief of the Cleveland Press newspaper, who published a number of opinionated editorials in which he expressed his belief that Sam was guilty and attempted to pressure the police into arresting him. Following the trial, Seltzer published an autobiography about his life titled The Years Were Good, in which he took credit for his role in helping bring Sam Sheppard to justice. While F. Lee Bailey was pursuing the appeals process on this, a lot of additional drama would take place in Sam's personal life. Near the end of our last episode, I mentioned that Sam suffered an onslaught of tragedy after he was convicted of Marilyn's murder, as only 2.5 weeks following the conclusion of the trial, his mother, Ethel Sheppard, died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. And only 11 days after that, Sam's father, Richard Sheppard Sr., who had been diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer, succumbed to a hemorrhaging gastric ulcer. Sam was incarcerated at the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus, and in 1958, he voluntarily took part in cancer studies being conducted at the Sloan Kettering Institute for Cancer Research and Ohio State University's College of Medicine. They wanted to inject live cancer cells into healthy people's bodies to see if they would reject the cells more quickly than a patient with cancer, and the loss of his father may have influenced Sam's decision to participate in this experiment. When she was only 6 years old, Marilyn suffered her own terrible tragedy when her mother died during childbirth. This seemed to have a devastating effect on Marilyn's father, Thomas Reese, as Marilyn said she never felt particularly close to him growing up. Well, on February the 13th, 1963, Thomas decided to follow the same path as Ethel Sheppard when he was found dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound at a motel in East Cleveland. At the time, his former son-in-law was getting a lot of new coverage in the press, which may have played a role in Thomas's decision to take his own life. By this point, Sam had gotten himself involved in a relationship with a woman named Ariane Teben Johans, a divorcee who lived in Germany. When Ariane learned about Sam's case, she became convinced he had been wrongly convicted and started corresponding with him in prison and even contributed money to Sam's defense by sending a $250 check to F. Lee Bailey. By the start of 1963, Sam and Ariane had corresponded so much that she traveled all the way from Germany to the Ohio State Penitentiary to meet him. During their first visit, Sam asked Ariane to marry him and she said yes, so she decided to permanently relocate to Rocky River. Naturally, their engagement made the news, but it soon became the center of controversy once it was discovered that Ariane's older half-sister was Magda Goebbels, the former wife of Nazi Germany's propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. Following Adolf Hitler's suicide in 1945, the couple decided to fatally poison their 6 children before they killed each other, but Ariane told the press that unlike her half-sister, neither she nor the rest of her family supported Nazism. Shortly after his engagement, Sam had his first hearing in front of the Ohio Parole Board, and it was attended by Ariane and a bunch of reporters. Ariane did not hesitate to openly express her disgust with the American justice system, which made an unfavorable impression with the parole board, and Sam's request for parole was denied. Sam soon had a meeting with the Ohio Director of Prisons, who urged him to get rid of, quote-unquote, that blonde bitch, and Sam responded by saying, quote, if you call her a blonde bitch again, your wife is a whore, end quote. As punishment for his remark, Sam wound up being thrown in solitary confinement, and Ariane's visiting and writing privileges were revoked. In September of 1963, a new hit TV series titled The Fugitive debuted on ABC, which featured actor David Janssen portraying Dr. Richard Kimball, a physician who is wrongly convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of his wife, but manages to escape custody and becomes a fugitive who attempts to prove his innocence by tracking down the real killer, a mysterious one-armed man. The Fugitive ran for 4 seasons and became one of the most popular TV shows of the 1960s, and of course, in 1993, it was adapted into a critically acclaimed blockbuster movie of the same name, which starred Harrison Ford as Kimball and Tommy Lee Jones in an Academy Award-winning performance as the U.S. Marshal who pursues him. For decades, it's been reported by many sources that The Fugitive was inspired by the Sam and Marilyn Sheppard case, as the plot involves a wrongly convicted doctor trying to clear his name in the murder of his wife, and it was theorized that the one-armed man from the show was a substitute for the mysterious bushy-haired intruder. Well, Roy Huggins, the creator of The Fugitive, has always denied the rumors that he was influenced by the Sheppard case because, obviously, the real-life Sam Sheppard never became a, fugitive. But in an odd coincidence, Susan Hayes, the young lab technician whom Sam had conducted an extramarital affair with, wound up getting married to the show's music supervisor, Ken Wilhoit. Well, even if the Sheppard murder had zero influence on the creation of The Fugitive, it's been theorized that the show may have influenced public perception of the real-life case. The series left zero ambiguity over the fact that Dr. Richard Kimball was an innocent, wrongly convicted man trying to clear his name, and since the peak of the show's popularity just happened to coincide with Sam Sheppard's attempts to overturn his conviction and clear his name, I'm sure it influenced some people into believing that Sam may have been innocent as well. As you might recall from our last episode, one of the most prominent figures in this case was Dr. Samuel Gerber, the Cuyahoga County coroner, who instantly became convinced that Sam was guilty and played a major role in his arrest and conviction. Well, in February of 1964, Dr. Gerber surprised everyone when he wrote a letter to Ohio Attorney General William Saxby in which he suggested that Ohio Governor Jim Rhodes pardon Sam. Gerber also told the media that he would support Sam's conviction being reduced from second-degree murder to manslaughter so that he could secure an early release on parole. While it was speculated that Gerber may have had second thoughts about Sam's guilt, the alternate explanation was that he wanted Sam to be paroled rather than exonerated by the courts, so he could avoid a potential wrongful conviction lawsuit. By this point, Sam was so anxious to marry Ariane that he wanted to be out of prison at any cost, and even sent a request for clemency to the Ohio Parole Board without F. Lee Bailey's knowledge. Well, around this same time period, Sam's chances for a successful appeal received a major boost when Bailey attended an overseas press club dinner in New York City. One of the attendees was Dorothy Kilgallen, one of the most popular syndicated gossip columnists in the United States, who was also famous for being a regular panelist on the popular TV game show What's My Line. As a side note, Dorothy Kilgallen died under mysterious circumstances on November the 8th, 1965, less than 2 years after this press club dinner, and since her death has always been surrounded by conspiracy theories involving the JFK assassination, I may do a Trail Went Cold episode about her case sometime down the line. Anyway, Kilgallen was one of just many reporters who had traveled to Cleveland to cover Sam Sheppard's trial, and at one point during a break in jury selection, Judge Edward J. Blythen invited her into his chambers. Judge Blythen died in 1958, but during a speech she gave at the press club dinner, Kilgallen revealed that when she went to see him, Blythen told her that the case against Sam was, quote-unquote, open and shut, and stated, quote, "Well, he's guilty as hell, there's no question about it," end quote. Since she considered Blythen's remarks to be off the record, Kilgallen never shared this information with anyone, even though it could have been grounds to disqualify the judge from presiding over the trial. Since she felt the evidence against Sam wasn't particularly strong, Kilgallen did not think he would even be convicted, but when he was, she wrote in one of her columns, quote, "This is the first time I have ever been scared by the jury system, and I mean scared," end quote. When Kilgallen shared her story about Blythen's remarks at the press club dinner, she received criticism from some of her colleagues for waiting so long to tell anyone. As you can imagine, F. Lee Bailey felt this new information would greatly increase his chances at overturning Sam's conviction, so he convinced Kilgallen to share her story in a sworn affidavit. Bailey also spoke to a couple of other witnesses who claimed that Judge Blythen had told them he believed Sam Sheppard was guilty before the trial concluded, which raised questions about his impartiality. Well, Bailey filed a writ of habeas corpus with the United States District Court for the Southern District of Ohio, arguing that Sam's constitutional right to a fair trial had been violated. On July 15, 1964, it was announced that District Judge Carl Andrew Weinman had vacated Sam's conviction. Judge Weinman described the original trial as a quote-unquote mockery of justice and believed that Sam had suffered no less than 5 separate violations of his 14th Amendment right to due process. Weinman felt that Judge Blythen should have disqualified himself from the trial and criticized a number of his decisions, such as failing to sequester the jury and not granting the defense's request for a change of venue due to all of the potentially prejudicial pretrial publicity. Judge Weinman was particularly disgusted over the biased media coverage and wrote in his opinion, quote, "If ever there was a trial by newspaper, this is a perfect example. And the most insidious violator was the Cleveland Press. For some reason, that newspaper took upon itself the role of accuser, judge, and jury," end quote. Weinman ordered the state of Ohio to release Sam on a $10,000 bond and ruled that if they did not refile charges against him within 60 days, the case would be permanently dismissed. After having served nearly 10 years behind bars, Sam finally walked out of prison on July the 16th, and not surprisingly, he married Ariane only 3 days later. The state of Ohio elected to appeal Judge Weinman's ruling to a 3-judge panel from the 6th Circuit Federal Court of Appeals in Akron. On May the 5th, 1965, it was announced that the panel had voted 2-1 to reverse Weinman's decision, and unless Sam's defense team could obtain a continuance, he would need to surrender himself and return to prison within 20 days. Well, Bailey appealed the judgment all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and Sam was allowed to remain free on bail while they reviewed it. In November of that year, the Supreme Court announced that they had agreed to hear the case, which would be known as, quote, Sheppard versus Maxwell, with the appellant being E.L. Maxwell, the warden of the Ohio State Penitentiary. On February the 28th, 1966, both sides would be presented in front of the Supreme Court, with F. Lee Bailey arguing for the petitioner, and Ohio Attorney General William Saxby and Cuyahoga County Prosecuting Attorney John T. Corrigan, no relation to defense attorney Bill Corrigan, arguing for the respondent. A decision was made just over 3 months later, on June the 6th, as the Supreme Court voted by an 8-1 majority to vacate Sam's conviction, as they felt that he did not receive a fair trial as required by the 6th Amendment and the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. They described the trial as having a quote-unquote carnival atmosphere and pretty much shared the same issues which were outlined in Judge Weinman's original opinion, as they believed the heavily sensationalized media coverage and publicity surrounding the case had seriously prejudiced the jury and that Judge Blythen should have disqualified himself due to his impartiality. The case was remanded back to district court, but within 2 days of the Supreme Court's decision, the state of Ohio announced that they intended to bring Sam to trial again. On September the 8th, Sam was arraigned on the charge of second-degree murder before he entered another plea of not guilty. The second trial would be dubbed the retrial of the century, and jury selection began on October the 24th, while opening statements took place 8 days later. Of course, this time around, Sam would be represented by F. Lee Bailey, and the case was prosecuted by Assistant Cuyahoga County Prosecutor Leo Spellici, as well as John T. Corrigan. Not surprisingly, there was a lot of media interest in the trial, but this time around, the presiding judge, Francis Talty, ordered that all photographers and cameramen stay outside the building, barred reporters from obtaining any information about the trial other than what happened in court, and kept the jury sequestered at a hotel. Unlike the previous trial, the defense was able to present an expert witness who performed their own forensic analysis of the murder scene as Dr. Paul Leland Kirk took the stand to finally present his findings from 1955. Kirk expressed his opinion that Marilyn was likely murdered by an intruder, as based on the pattern of the blood spatter evidence, Kirk felt that the killer was left-handed, whereas Sam was right-handed. His conclusion was based on the fact that the east side of the bedroom had a horizontal arc of larger blood spots across the wall and closet doors, and Kirk believed this was cast-off blood produced by the backswing of a left-handed assailant swinging the murder weapon that fatally bludgeoned Marilyn. Kirk was particularly intrigued by a large 1-inch blood spot which was found on the lower third of the bedroom's closet door, only about 3 feet from where Marilyn's head rested. The blood was type O, whereas Sam's blood was type A, and while Marilyn also had type O blood, Kirk said that this blood had agglutination properties that distinguished it from Marilyn's blood, so he did not believe it belonged to her. Since Kirk believed that Marilyn's teeth were broken when she bit her attacker, his theory was that the bite opened up a wound in the killer's hand and caused them to get some of their blood on the closet door. Well, one of the key witnesses for the prosecution was Mary Cowan, the chief medical technologist at the Cuyahoga County Coroner's Office, who had testified at the original trial. As you might recall, Sam's wristwatch and some of his other personal items had been found outside in a canvas bag that was left on a hillside near the Sheppard residence, and Sam always believed that the killer took his wristwatch after he was knocked unconscious on the beach. Traces of blood were found on the watch's band, and Sam's explanation was that the blood likely got on there when he checked Marilyn's pulse in the bedroom before the watch was stolen. Well, after performing a new forensic analysis, Cowan was now convinced that the blood spots on the watch were blood spatter and could only have been caused if Sam had bludgeoned his wife to death. Attempts at blood typing were inconclusive, so it could not be determined who the blood actually belonged to. When Kirk took the witness stand and a color slide of the bloody watch was projected into the courtroom, he conceded that the tadpole-shaped blood spots along the watch's rim did resemble blood spatter. However, since the spots did not have a symmetrical trail, Kirk believed that the blood could have wound up there by a contact transfer if Sam had touched his wife. When a blood expert named Roger Marsters was called upon to testify, he was asked to examine large slides of the wristwatch and point out a pair of spots on the inside of the watch's bands which looked similar to the spots on the rim. Marsters believed these spots were blood, and this seemed to poke a hole in the idea of them being blood spatter, since it should have been impossible for spatter to wind up on the inside of the watch band if Sam had bludgeoned Marilyn. The alternative explanation is that the killer could have gotten this blood on the watch when they stole it from Sam's wrist. The defense called upon a number of experts to testify that the neck injuries Sam sustained after his alleged attack from the intruder were legitimate and would have been difficult, if not impossible, for him to inflict on himself. One of the most dramatic portions of the trial was when F. Lee Bailey got to cross-examine Dr. Samuel Gerber, the Cuyahoga County coroner who played a major role in Sam's conviction. Following the murder, an imprint had been found on Marilyn's blood-stained pillow, which some people felt was an imprint of the murder weapon, which had never been found. At the original trial, Dr. Gerber testified that the imprint resembled a surgical instrument, which he felt pointed towards Sam being the killer, but since this was based on nothing more than pure speculation, the defense had objected to Gerber's remark. Well, this time around, Bailey finally got Gerber to admit on the stand that he could not be certain this imprint had been made by the murder weapon, and he had no idea what this so-called surgical instrument actually was. In fact, Gerber conceded that prior to the first trial, he had visited surgical stores all over the United States to find a surgical instrument that matched the imprint on Marilyn's pillow, but he was unable to find one, and this revelation caused considerable damage to Gerber's credibility. It turned out that on August 1st, 1955, just over 7 months following the conclusion of the original trial, a swimmer who lived in Bay Village next to the Sheppard residence had found a dented and corroded flashlight in some shallow water in Lake Erie. Even though it was never conclusively proven if this flashlight was the murder weapon, it still seemed like a more logical possibility than a surgical instrument. Unfortunately, when the evidence in this case was re-examined decades later, the flashlight could not be found, and its current whereabouts are unknown. For his part, prosecutor Leo Spelliscy abandoned the original theory about a surgical instrument being the murder weapon and spent a great deal of time focusing on Sam's extramarital affairs and his potential motives for killing Marilyn. Susan Hayes was not called upon to testify as a witness, but Spelliscy read out Sam's original statements to police and his testimony at Dr. Gerber's public inquest, where he initially denied his affair with Susan. Bailey also wanted to use the opportunity to implicate an alternate suspect in Marilyn's murder. At the end of our last episode, I spoke about a man named Richard Eberling, who ran a window washing business and had the Sheppards as customers at the time Marilyn was murdered. In 1959, Eberling was charged with larceny as he had been stealing items from a number of his customers' homes. A pair of Marilyn Sheppard's rings were in his possession, as he had stolen them from the residence of Sam's brother Richard years after the crime took place. Even though he was briefly questioned about the murder, Eberling wound up passing a polygraph and pretty much dropped off law enforcement's radar, though in his aforementioned book, The Sheppard Murder Case, Paul Holmes explored the possibility of Eberling being a compelling alternate suspect. Eberling was called upon as a witness at the retrial in order to discuss the layout of the Sheppard residence, but no accusations were directed towards him, and at no point did Sam ever identify Eberling as the intruder who attacked him. While Bailey did briefly consider Eberling to be the best potential alternate suspect, he changed his mind once he learned that Eberling had passed a polygraph. By the time the retrial rolled around, Bailey stated that he now believed the real killer was a neighbor of the Sheppards. While Bailey never used their name during the trial, he would later reveal that he was referring to Esther Houck, the wife of Bay Village Mayor Spencer Houck, who were the first two people to arrive at the murder scene after Sam called them for help. Following the murder, unconfirmed rumors apparently circulated that Spencer and Marilyn had been having an affair, and at one point, Spencer was interrogated by the Cleveland Police Department for 4 hours after Sam's brother, Steve Sheppard, suggested that Spencer be looked at as a potential suspect. At one point, Spencer had agreed to take a polygraph and was told that he showed signs of deception on 2 questions: what happened to the shirt, and are you telling the truth to all answers? While Bailey never openly said this at trial, the main reason he favored Esther Houck as a suspect over Eberling was because he believed the murder may have been committed by 2 people. He felt that after Sam went to sleep on the daybed, Spencer left his home and went to the Sheppard residence and had sex with Marilyn in the guest bedroom. When Esther woke up in the middle of the night, she discovered that Spencer was gone, but since she already had her suspicions that he was having an affair with Marilyn, she headed to the Sheppard's house as well. When she went upstairs into the bedroom and caught Marilyn and Spencer in bed together, Esther, who happened to be left-handed, bludgeoned Marilyn to death in a jealous rage. Spencer witnessed the whole thing and helped his wife cover up the crime, and when Sam heard Marilyn screaming and ran into the bedroom, it may have been Spencer who clubbed Sam from behind. While Sam was unconscious, Esther fled the house, and Spencer went to the trouble of pulling the drawers out downstairs in an attempt to make it look like Marilyn's death was the result of a burglary gone wrong. But when Sam woke up and saw Spencer escaping out the back door, he chased him out of the house before he was knocked unconscious again on the beach. At the trial, Bailey called upon a witness named Jack Kraken, who had worked as a bread delivery man for a bakery and often went to the Sheppard residence. Kraken claimed that one morning in February of 1954, he arrived at the house and looked inside the kitchen window. He said he saw Marilyn chatting at the table with what he described as a quote-unquote distinguished older man before they embraced and kissed each other. Since he had never met Sam before, Kraken initially believed that the man was Marilyn's husband until she gave him a key and said, quote, "Don't let Sam see this." Even though Bailey was not allowed to introduce this as evidence at the trial, Kraken had previously looked at a photo lineup and picked out Spencer Houck as the man he saw inside the kitchen. Bailey was also not allowed to reveal that prior to the trial, he had Sam undergo hypnosis to see if he could recall any additional details from the night of the murder. Sam said that he remembered the feeling of his neck being crushed under someone's foot and hearing a voice talk about whether to kill him. Sam also said the person who crushed him walked with a limp, and Spencer had a limp in his right leg due to a childhood bout of polio. By the time of the retrial, Spencer and Esther Houck were divorced, but Bailey called Esther to the witness stand. Once again, he could not directly accuse Esther of the murder, but he asked her if she had ignited a coal fire in her fireplace on the morning of the murder, and Esther confirmed that she had. Bailey then produced some national weather reports which showed that the temperature never got cooler than 69 degrees Fahrenheit on July the 4th, 1954. Since there didn't seem to be any logical reason for Esther to start a fire that morning, Bailey seemed to be inferring that she was burning bloody clothing or other evidence from the murder. Unlike the original trial, Sam did not take the stand to testify in his own defense, and while Bailey never mentioned this at the time, he would later reveal that Sam's time in prison had caused his physical and mental health to greatly deteriorate, and he was now under the heavy influence of alcohol and pills. Sam's issues began when he injured his back in prison and became addicted to painkillers, and Bailey said there were times during the trial when Sam appeared to have no idea what was going on, so he obviously did not want to put him on the witness stand. During his closing statement, Bailey described the prosecution's case as, quote-unquote, 10 pounds of hogwash in a 5-pound bag, and he seemed to make an impression on the jury. On November the 16th, after deliberating for 12 hours, they found Sam not guilty of second-degree murder. The jurors later told the press that the original vote was 7 for acquittal, 4 for conviction, and 1 undecided, but they eventually reached a unanimous not guilty verdict because they felt the police investigation had been sloppy and did not feel that the prosecution presented a compelling motive for why Sam would murder Marilyn. Following the acquittal, Sam started making cryptic statements in which he implied that he had smuggled a gun into the courtroom and would have killed himself if he was found guilty for the second time. Years later, Sam's son Chip revealed that his father had outlined a plan in which he would bring an unloaded handgun into the courtroom and pull it out and start acting crazy if he was found guilty, which would prompt the police to shoot him in an act of suicide by cop. However, it was never conclusively established if Sam actually had a gun in his possession on the day of the verdict. What is known for certain is that on December the 7th, 3 weeks after the trial, Sam appeared as a guest on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Following Sam's acquittal, Bailey sent a 15-page letter to the Bay Village Police Department as Fred Drenkin, the first patrolman who had arrived at the murder scene, was now the police chief. Bailey outlined many reasons why he felt that Spencer and Esther Houck were responsible for the crime, so a grand jury was convened in Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court. Even though a number of witnesses were called upon to testify, including Sam, Spencer, and Esther, the grand jury declined to indict the Houcks, and Bailey always believed that the proceedings were perfunctory and only done for PR purposes. Sam teamed up with journalist Bill Levy to publish a book about his experience titled Endure and Conquer, in which he presented his side of the story and continued to maintain that he was innocent of Marilyn's murder. However, years later, Levy would admit that he felt conflicted about the whole project, stating, quote, "There was never any question in my mind whether he did it," end quote. Bailey was also able to secure $125,000 for the movie rights to Endure and Conquer from prominent Hollywood producer Robert Evans, who was the head of production at Paramount Pictures and went on to turn out such classics as Rosemary's Baby, The Godfather, and Chinatown. This money was primarily used to pay Sam's legal fees, and in 1970, the story was adapted into a fictionalized movie titled The Lawyer, which is only loosely based on the Sheppard case. As you probably guessed from the title, the lead character was a defense attorney played by actor Barry Newman, who was heavily modeled on F. Lee Bailey and is called upon to represent a physician who is accused of murdering his wife. And I hope you don't mind a spoiler alert for a 55-year-old movie, but the ending of The Lawyer presents a scenario very similar to Bailey's theory about Spencer and Esther Houck being responsible for Marilyn's murder. Sam continued to remain married to Ariane Teben Johans, and they tried relocating to her native Germany for a while before returning to the United States. Ariane also became pregnant with Sam's child, but wound up suffering a miscarriage, and their relationship began to deteriorate. Sam tried to restart his medical career as the Ohio Medical Board eventually returned his license to practice. In May of 1968, he joined the staff of the Youngstown Osteopathic Hospital and was granted surgical privileges again, but unfortunately, his issues with pills and alcohol had spiraled out of control and greatly affected his work. Only 5 days after his privileges were restored, Sam performed back surgery on a 41-year-old female patient and accidentally cut an artery, causing her to lose 5 pints of blood. While Sam was able to repair the artery, he did not tell anyone about his mistake, and the patient's internal bleeding caused her to lapse into a coma and die. In spite of this, the hospital continued to allow Sam to perform surgery, and 3 months after this incident, he made another fatal mistake when he nicked an artery while removing the spinal disc from a 19-year-old male patient, and this also caused him to bleed to death internally. Since wrongful death lawsuits were filed against the hospital by the 2 patients' families, Sam agreed to resign by the end of the year, though he attempted to start a new career in a most unusual field, which I will talk about momentarily. As for Sam's marriage to Ariane, things got so bad that she wound up contacting the police about him on numerous occasions and even filed a restraining order. She alleged that Sam was cheating on her, had stolen her money, and frequently threatened her, even going so far as to pull a gun on her at one point. The couple officially divorced in October of 1969, but by this point, Sam had become involved in a relationship with a 19-year-old woman named Colleen Strickland, and they soon got married during a trip to Mexico. Okay, so here comes my favorite part of this whole saga. If you've been following this podcast for a long time, you'll probably know that I'm a lifelong professional wrestling fan, and I'm about to tell you about the most bizarre wrestling true crime crossover I've ever seen. You see, Sam had joined the prison wrestling team while he was incarcerated, and since Colleen Strickland's father, George Strickland, happened to be a professional wrestler/promoter, he offered to train his new son-in-law and manage his career, even though it's very unusual for someone to start training as a wrestler when they're in their mid-40s. On August 9, 1969, Sam made his debut and wrestled Wild Bill Scholl at Waverly High School in Waverly, Ohio, at an event that was intended to raise money for cancer research. But the most insane part of this story is that Sam came out to the ring dressed in a white doctor's lab coat and wearing a stethoscope around his neck, and he was billed as Killer Sam Sheppard. You see, even though Sam had always wanted to clear his name, he was not above capitalizing on his infamy as a convicted murderer for the purposes of a pro wrestling gimmick. Sam was a hated heel, aka a villain, but in the wacky world of wrestling, that can be a major benefit if people are willing to pay money to see you get beat. Over the course of the next several months, Sam wrestled over 40 matches and sometimes teamed up with George Strickland, and he did apparently draw good crowds. Perhaps Sam's greatest contribution to the wrestling business was that he came up with a submission hold called the mandibular nerve pinch, which involved placing his middle and ring fingers into his opponent's mouth and placing his thumb under their jaw in order to apply pressure and make them submit. Well, nearly 3 decades later, in 1996, this hold would be taken on by none other than Mick Foley, one of the most popular superstars in wrestling history. Foley started working in the World Wrestling Federation as the character Mankind, a deranged masked lunatic who used the mandibular nerve pinch as his finishing maneuver and renamed it the Mandible Claw. When Mankind eventually became a popular babyface, aka a good guy, he started putting a sock puppet on his hand named Mr. Socko when he applied the Mandible Claw. So yeah, while this case may not have actually inspired The Fugitive, it did inspire a beloved pro wrestler to create a sock puppet character that he shoved into his opponent's mouths, and the whole gimmick eventually wound up drawing millions of dollars in merchandise sales. And that's not a sentence I ever thought I would recite on a true crime podcast. Anyway, by the time Sam married Colleen Strickland, his alcohol problem had significantly worsened, and he was reportedly drinking as much as 2 fists of liquor per day. After Sam went to prison, his son Chip was raised by his Uncle Steve and Aunt Betty, and by this point, he was a 22-year-old long-haired hippie who smoked pot and protested the Vietnam War. Since Sam disapproved of his son's lifestyle, they had a strained relationship, and during the spring of 1970, Chip brought his girlfriend to his father's house in Columbus for a visit. At one point, Sam took a cocklebur plant, stuck it on the crotch of Chip's jeans, and said, quote, "Because you're such a big prick." But this would turn out to be one of the last exchanges they ever had. A short time later, on the morning of April the 6th, Sam was found dead on the floor of his kitchen as he had collapsed after vomiting blood. At the time, Sam had Librium, 6 phenobarbital pills, and a half-gallon of vodka in his system. His exact cause of death was determined to be Wernicke's encephalopathy, a liver disease triggered by a lack of vitamins which causes the nervous system to shut down. Sam was 46 years old at the time, and in an ironic turn of events, that movie I just mentioned, The Lawyer, was released theatrically only 4 weeks before his death. Since they were in Europe at the time, Ship and Sam's brother Steve did not attend his funeral. As for Sam's other brother Richard, he passed away in February of 1980 at the age of 63, though Steve managed to live until July of 2012 before he passed away at the age of 92. The case eventually faded from the spotlight, and debate continued to rage on about whether Sam was actually guilty or innocent of Marilyn's murder. However, in 1989, interest would be rekindled when a journalist/author named James Neff learned that none other than Richard Eberling had been convicted of murder. I already mentioned how Eberling ran a window washing business and serviced the Sheppard residence in 1954, and years after the murder, he would be questioned after making some strange, cryptic comments. The oddest moment occurred when one of the detectives decided to call Eberling's bluff and ask him why his blood had been found at the Sheppard residence, even though this wasn't actually true. Eberling responded by claiming that he cut his finger in the kitchen and dripped blood throughout the house, but kept changing his story. In spite of this, Eberling was never considered to be a serious suspect, and in 1960, he was hired to wash the windows of a wealthy elderly widow named Ethel May Durkin, who lived in a mansion in the Lakewood suburb. Since Durkin had no children of her own, she struck up a close friendship with Eberling, and he eventually started running errands for her and taking care of all of her household responsibilities. During the 1970s, Durkin broke her knee during a fall, and since she now required full-time care, she hired Eberling to be a nurse's aide. Eberling also got access to her money and often lavishly spent it on himself. By this point, Eberling had befriended a man named O.B. Henderson, who worked as a personal assistant for then Cleveland Mayor Ralph Perk, and Henderson helped take care of Durkin and often hung out around her house. On November the 15th, 1983, paramedics were summoned to the Durkin residence and discovered her lying comatose on the hardwood floor with a bruised face, swollen right eye, and blood on her mouth. Eberling was there and identified himself as Durkin's nephew, and he told the paramedics that she had been sitting in a living room chair and got up and walked a few steps before she screamed and fell on her face. At the hospital, x-rays would show that Durkin had a fracture near her second vertebra, leaving her paralyzed from the neck down, and she was kept alive on a respirator for 6 weeks until she was taken off life support on January the 3rd, 1984, and died at the age of 90. At the time, no foul play was suspected, so no autopsy was performed, and her death was ruled to be accidental. In her will, Durkin had appointed Eberling to be guardian and executor of her estate, and wrote, quote, "Dearest Richard, a gentleman who was to me a son I always wished for," end quote. Eberling wound up inheriting 70% of Durkin's $1.4 million estate, which he would split with O.B. Henderson. However, in 1987, the Lakewood Police Department were contacted by a woman named Patricia Bogar, who had befriended Eberling and Henderson years earlier and collaborated with them on some burglaries. Eberling had apparently promised Bogar a cut of the money he inherited from Durkin's estate, but he never paid her, so out of revenge, she decided to snitch on him. Bogar revealed that prior to Durkin's death, a couple named Dale and Beverly Scheidler had assisted Eberling with forging a false will, which is the only reason he was listed as guardian and executor of the estate. This compelled the Lakewood PD to launch a new investigation into Durkin's death, and they gradually began building a case against the conspirators. When Beverly Scheidler was interrogated in July of 1988, she finally broke down and confessed about her own complicity in helping Eberling forge a fake will, so the Scheidlers, Eberling, and Henderson were all arrested and indicted on the charges of forgery, perjury, aggravated grand theft, tampering with evidence, and tampering with records. Scheidler also revealed that Eberling had told her that he hit Durkin and her death was not the result of an accidental fall, so Durkin's body was exhumed and given an autopsy for the first time. The pathologist discovered a hematoma on the back of her head, which seemed to confirm that Durkin was struck from behind and had her neck broken. As a result, Durkin's death was officially reclassified as a homicide, and Eberling and Henderson were charged with aggravated murder. In July of 1989, the two men went on trial and were both convicted of all charges and received sentences of life imprisonment. A more extensive investigation revealed that Durkin's two sisters had both disliked Eberling and tried to convince her to fire him before they each wound up dying under suspicious circumstances. During the early morning hours of May the 20th, 1962, 62-year-old Myrtle Frey was murdered in the bedroom of her apartment by someone who bludgeoned her, suffocated her with a pillow, and strangled her while she slept. The murder was never solved, but years later, Eberling supposedly revealed details about the crime which were not public knowledge, such as how Frey's false teeth had been soaking in a glass next to her bed when she was killed. There was not enough evidence to prove Eberling's involvement, as a bloody fingerprint was found on a bedroom windowsill which did not match him, but in retrospect, the crime seemed to have a number of similarities to the murder of Marilyn Sheppard. Nearly 8 years later, in March of 1970, Ethel Mae Durkin's other sister, 70-year-old Sarah Bell Farrow, was living with her at her mansion when she suffered a terrible fall down the basement staircase, which caused her to break both her arms and legs. These injuries eventually proved fatal, as Farrow died in a nursing home 1 month later. At the time, no one suspected foul play, but it seemed like quite a coincidence that Durkin wound up being killed by a so-called accidental fall 13 years later. If Eberling was responsible for murdering Marilyn Sheppard, Ethel Mae Durkin, and her two sisters, this would have officially made him a full-fledged serial killer, but there was also another surprising link between Eberling and the Sheppards. In 1956, Eberling was dating 23-year-old Barbara Kinzel, who had once worked as a nurse at Bayview Hospital and actually helped treat Sam's injuries when he was admitted to the hospital following Marilyn's murder. On the 4th of July weekend that year, which was the 2-year anniversary of Marilyn's death, Eberling was behind the wheel of Kinzel's Ford convertible when he crashed into the rear end of a transport truck which was parked on the side of the highway. While Eberling only suffered a bump on the head, Kinzel suffered a fatal skull fracture. Even though Eberling said the truck's back end was extended into his lane, the driver always maintained that he had parked at least 6 feet away from the highway, and since the road was dry, it seemed odd that Eberling could have lost control of the car and crashed like that. At the time, no one believed that Kinzel's death was anything but an accident, but given the amount of suspicious deaths which were linked to Eberling over the years, there has been speculation that he may have murdered Kinzel beforehand and staged the crash to make her death look accidental. Regardless, after learning about Eberling's conviction for the murder of Ethel Mae Durkin, James Neff sent him a telegram at the Cuyahoga County Jail and asked if they could speak about the Sheppard case. Eberling agreed to the request and recounted his time having worked as a window washer for the Sheppards. He described Marilyn as being a very nice lady, but even though he said he only met Sam on one occasion, Eberling felt he was a jerk. Eberling once again recounted his story about having cut his finger and bled at the Sheppard residence 2 days before the murder, but even though Neff never asked him if he committed the crime, Eberling took him by surprise when he made this statement completely out of nowhere. Quote, "I fully expect to be convicted of killing Marilyn Sheppard." End quote. At one point, Eberling agreed to take another polygraph exam while answering questions about the case, and much like his original polygraph from 1959, the results showed no signs of deception in his answers. However, years later, other polygraph experts were shown the results of his 2 tests and concluded that they were unreliable since they felt the tests were not administered properly. Well, it was around this time period when Sam and Marilyn's now adult son Chip decided to take a newfound interest in the case. Like I mentioned earlier, Chip's relationship with his father had been very strained prior to his death, and he would later be diagnosed as having untreated chronic post-traumatic stress syndrome, which caused him to experience depression and suicidal thoughts. In fact, shortly before Christmas in 1971, Chip had to be hospitalized in a psychiatric unit after he suffered a nervous breakdown and started hallucinating. Chip then decided to cut his wrists and start swinging his bloody arms towards the wall in what almost appeared to be an attempt to recreate his mother's murder scene. After being raised by his Uncle Steve and Aunt Betty, Chip actually lived with F. Lee Bailey and his family for a while he attended Boston University. He later became a dental technician and relocated to Oakland, California, but he eventually decided to become a major advocate for prison reform who staunchly opposed the death penalty and worked to help children whose lives were affected by violent crime. After maintaining his privacy for decades, Chip decided to start publicly speaking about his family's case and eventually got in touch with James Neff, who informed him about his odd interactions with Richard Eberling. Chip decided to write to Eberling in prison, and over the next few years, they would exchange a series of letters, and Chip even decided to start visiting him. Eberling told Chip that when he was a young boy, Marilyn had asked him to keep an eye on her son during one of his window washing jobs at their house. At one point, Eberling drew up a diagram of the Sheppard residence, and considering that over 35 years had passed, Chip felt that Eberling's memory of the layout was remarkably accurate. While Eberling was bald, and Sam had described having an encounter with a bushy-haired intruder, Eberling was known for having worn a hairpiece in the past, and it would have made sense for him to disguise himself if he performed a home invasion. Eberling also expressed his belief that Marilyn's real killer was Esther Houck, and that her husband Spencer assisted with the cover-up. The Houcks had both passed away during the early 1980s, and while she was dying, Esther reportedly called her daughter to her bedside and stated, quote, "After I'm gone, if they accuse me of the Sheppard murder, promise you'll defend me," end quote. In addition to being the town mayor, Spencer Houck also owned a local butcher shop, and Eberling claimed that he was washing windows at the Sheppard residence on July 2nd, 1954, when he saw Spencer deliver some meat there. Shortly thereafter, Eberling said that Esther stopped by the house and got into a shouting match with Marilyn, in which she cried out, quote, "If you don't leave him alone, I'll kill you." Later that day, Marilyn spoke to Eberling and assured him that Esther had called her up and apologized for her outburst, as Esther had been drinking and under the influence of medication and lost her temper and became jealous when she saw Spencer make his meat delivery to the residence. Days later, after Marilyn's murder took place, Eberling said that he was washing windows at Richard Sheppard's residence while Sam was recuperating there. Eberling spoke to Sam and offered his condolences, but when he mentioned the incident in which Esther had threatened Marilyn, Sam replied, quote, "Don't let that be a problem. It's all taken care of. Richard, leave it alone," end quote. Sometime around 1969 or 1970, Eberling said that he randomly bumped into Sam at a delicatessen, and they had a conversation in which Sam finally revealed the truth about who killed Marilyn. According to Eberling, Sam told him that he had been carrying on a secret gay affair with Spencer, but Esther mistakenly assumed that her husband was cheating with Marilyn and killed her in a fit of rage. The new wrinkle in this theory is that both Spencer and Sam conspired to help Esther cover up the crime, but Sam wound up taking the fall for it and presumably remained silent in order to prevent anyone from finding out about his gay affair. Of course, no evidence was ever found to corroborate any of Eberling's wild claims, so needless to say, you should take them with a huge grain of salt. Regardless, Chip Sheppard was still intent on clearing his father's name and suspected that Eberling was feeding him these false stories in order to divert suspicion away from his own complicity. When the film adaptation of The Fugitive was released in 1993 and became one of the biggest blockbusters of the year, it seemed to rejuvenate interest in the Sheppard case, even though, like I mentioned earlier, the rumors that the crime helped inspire The Fugitive are not actually true. But Chip worked alongside attorney Cynthia Cooper to co-author a book titled Mockery of Justice, The True Story of the Sheppard Murder Case, which was released in September of 1995, and pushed forward the narrative that Sam had been wrongly convicted. Chip also retained the services of an attorney named Terry Gilbert, and only 1 month after the book's release, a lawsuit was filed in Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court on behalf of Sam Sheppard's estate, asking for $2 million in damages from the state of Ohio and an official declaration of innocence for Sam. The case was assigned to Common Pleas Court Judge Ronald Suster, and in February of 1996, he ordered the current Cuyahoga County coroner to gather all available evidence from the case and release it to the Sheppard estate for DNA testing. Prior to his death, Sam had waived attorney-client confidentiality as he wanted all information from his case to be made public so the state of Ohio would be granted full access to his defense attorney's original files. The new forensic testing would be performed by Dr. Muhammad Tahir, the director of the DNA and Serology laboratories at the Indianapolis-Marion County Forensic Services Agency. Dr. Tahir was able to extract samples of Sam's DNA from the envelope flaps and postage stamps of old love letters he had once written to his wife, and he obtained Marilyn's DNA on the organ tissue slides from her autopsy. Judge Suster also issued a court order requiring Eberling to submit a sample of his blood for DNA testing, and he complied. In September of 1997, Sam's body was exhumed from his grave at Forest Lawn Memorial Gardens in Columbus, as Dr. Tahir wanted a better sample of his DNA. After the exhumation was completed, DNA was extracted from Sam's remains, and at Chip's request, his father's body was subsequently cremated. The biggest concern with the new testing was the possibility of contamination, as DNA profiling was not a thing back in 1954, and evidence was often handled by people who did not wear masks or gloves. Indeed, a number of the surviving blood samples had degraded over the years, but Dr. Tahir performed testing on the blood stain found on Sam's pants, as well as wood chips containing drops of blood which had been preserved from the stairs at the Sheppard residence. He claimed that the results showed that Sam and Marilyn were not the source of the blood, but Eberling could not be excluded. Tahir also performed the same testing on a 1/4-inch diameter blood drop found on a trail across the back porch, and he said that it seemed to match Eberling's genetic profile, which was shared by 1 out of every 7,000 white males in the United States. However, since the polymerase chain reaction control built into this test failed, Tahir said that he could only be about 80% certain of the result rather than 100%. For this reason, Tahir would not be allowed to share this result with the jury at the upcoming civil trial. One of the most important pieces of evidence would be a glass vial of dried blood which had been collected from the closet door of Marilyn's murder scene by Dr. Paul Leland Kirk. Kirk died in 1970, but when boxes of materials from his office were being thrown out, one of his students noticed a box which had Sheppard case written on the outside, so he decided to retrieve it. He wound up holding on to it for over 25 years and turned it over to the Sheppard estate once he learned about the new investigation into the murder. Tahir ran a DQ-alpha polymarker test on the dried blood and discovered that it contained a mixture of 2 people's DNA. Once Marilyn's DNA profile was subtracted from this mixture, Tahir was left with a single DNA profile which matched 1 out of every 42 persons. This was approximately 2.4% of the population of the United States, and while this did not directly implicate Eberling, he just happened to share this profile and could not be excluded as being the source of the DNA. When Dr. Tahir was examining the slides from Marilyn's original autopsy, he found what appeared to be 2 very small sperm heads which had been taken from her vaginal swab, even though Dr. Lester Adelson, who had performed the autopsy, had concluded there was no sperm present. According to Tahir, Sam and Eberling could not be excluded as the source of the first sperm sample, but he was able to extract a 4.1 DNA marker from the second sample. While Eberling's DNA had a 4.1 marker, Sam and Marilyn's did not, but of course, this hardly proved Eberling's involvement, since a large portion of the male population of the United States had this marker. And when Tahir testified at the trial, he said the sperm samples were so small that he did not believe the perpetrator ejaculated, and the samples may have been nothing more than undegraded sperm which was left there when Marilyn had consensual sex with someone in the days prior to the murder. During the summer of 1998, James Neff visited Eberling in prison to interview him, but he was in very poor health by this point and confined to a wheelchair. Neff claimed that Eberling started rambling incoherently about finding himself in the Sheppard's bloody bedroom and stated, quote, "My God, I had never seen anything like it. I got out of there," end quote. When Neff started asking follow-up questions, Eberling stopped talking, and this would be their final interview they ever had together. A few weeks later, on July the 25th, Eberling died at the age of 68. Stephanie Tubbs Jones, the Cuyahoga County prosecutor at that time, agreed to perform a review of the Sheppard estate's new findings, but she ultimately reached the conclusion that Dr. Tahir's DNA findings were inadmissible and Sam was likely guilty. She refused to reopen the investigation and filed a motion with the Ohio Supreme Court, arguing that the civil lawsuit should be dismissed since the statute of limitations for filing a wrongful conviction lawsuit on behalf of a deceased individual had long expired. However, in December of 1998, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled by a 4-3 vote that the civil suit could go forward and would take place in Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. Even though he was a defense attorney, Terry Gilbert would technically function as the prosecutor representing the Sheppard estate and push forward the argument that Sam had been wrongly convicted, while prosecutors William Mason and Steve Deaver would function as defense attorneys for the state of Ohio and argue that Sam was the real killer all along. Chip told reporters that the upcoming court case would not be the third trial of his father, but rather the quote-unquote trial of the county prosecutor's office. But before the trial could begin, a number of interesting developments took place. In order to present a potential motive for Sam having killed Marilyn, the state wanted to explore the theory that he was not the biological father of her unborn child. I mentioned in our last episode that during Marilyn's autopsy, her fetus was extracted from her body and given its own separate autopsy, but even though attempts were made at fetal blood typing, the child's paternity could not be established. After Sam's trial, the coroner's office returned the fetus to the Sheppard family and it was buried alongside Marilyn, but with Chip's consent, the state decided to exhume her body in October of 1999 in order to retrieve the fetus. Due to the passage of time, the fetus's tissues had heavily degraded, so paternity could not be conclusively established, but the Cuyahoga County coroner, Dr. Elizabeth Balraj, acknowledged that based on the results of the new testing, Sam was in all probability the child's father. Chip requested that Marilyn and the fetus be cremated, and their ashes would be interred alongside Sam's ashes in a mausoleum at Knollwood Cemetery in Mayfield Heights. 1 month after the exhumation, William Mason told the press that he had recently received some new information from a woman named Phyllis Moretti. Back in 1969, Moretti owned a beauty salon in Columbus that was often frequented by Sam and his girlfriend. In April of that year, Moretti held a party at her salon and Sam was in attendance, so she presented him with a copy of his book Endure and Conquer and asked him to sign it. Sam signed, quote, "To Phyllis, our best wishes, Dr. Sam H. Sheppard, M.D., but after she got home, Moretti made a rather disturbing discovery. The book's dust jacket contained the sentence, quote, 'Did Sam do it?' and Moretti noticed that Sam had apparently written the word yes beneath it. Moretti was left so perturbed by this that she decided to keep the book locked away for the next 3 decades, but once the civil trial started making the news, she decided to come forward and present the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office with a copy of her signed book. Moretti also still had photographs from this party which seemed to corroborate her story, as it showed Sam standing next to her with a copy of his book on a nearby counter. A handwriting expert seemed convinced that Sam had actually written the word yes, and the book would be presented as evidence at the civil trial. The trial, titled A State of Samuel H. Sheppard versus State of Ohio, finally began on January 31st, 2000, and while the plaintiff would be allowed to present evidence that implicated Richard Eberling as an alternate suspect, Judge Suster ruled that they cannot mention Eberling's conviction for the murder of Ethel May Durkin, as well as the other suspicious deaths he was linked to, as he feared that this could prejudice the jury. The first witness to take the stand was F. Lee Bailey, who acknowledged that he had explored the possibility of Eberling being an alternate suspect prior to Sam's second trial in 1966, but ultimately decided to dismiss this idea because he heard that Eberling passed a polygraph test. Bailey said that if he had been aware of this new incriminating information about Eberling back then, he likely would have put more focus on him as a suspect at the retrial. One potentially interesting witness was a woman named Kathy Collins Dial, who had been hired by Eberling to work as a nurse's aide for Ethel May Durkin in 1984. While drinking together one night, Dial claimed that they started a conversation about what it would be like to kill someone. Eberling asked Dial if she had ever heard the name Marilyn Sheppard, and when she said no, Eberling replied, quote, "Well, I did her, and someone else paid the bill," end quote. He then mentioned getting into a scuffle with Marilyn's husband and hitting him on the head with a pail. Eberling told Dial not to repeat what he said, but at the time, she just thought he was making the story up. However, in March of 1996, Dial watched an episode about the Sheppard case on the news magazine TV show Inside Edition, and after learning that Eberling was now a legitimate suspect in the murder, she decided to contact Terry Gilbert and inform him about his confession. Well, the state tried to downplay Dial's credibility by getting her to acknowledge that she had learned about Eberling's arrest for the murder of Ethel May Durkin, yet never bothered to contact the authorities at that time to let them know about the so-called confession to another murder. Dial's ex-husband also testified at the trial, and even though they had been married from 1980 to 1986, and she often shared details with him about her conversations with Eberling, he claimed that she never said anything about hearing him admit to killing Marilyn Sheppard. Robert Lee Parks, an inmate who had served time in prison with Eberling, had also claimed that he heard him confess to Marilyn's murder shortly before he died. But Parks' story was not considered to be credible, as a number of other inmates reported that Park had bragged that he was going to make a lot of money if he intimidated Eberling into confessing to the Sheppard murder. At one point, Parks allegedly bragged about how he had beaten a confession out of Eberling and was going to become rich and famous for it. Prior to the trial, Chip received a letter from a man named Vern Lund, who had once been an employee for Eberle's window washing business, Dick's Cleaning Service. Lund was dying of cancer, but wanted to reveal that he had shown up at the Sheppard residence to wash their windows on July 2nd, 1954. Lund confirmed that Eberling was not there, even though this was the date that Eberling claimed he cut his finger and bled throughout the house. Lund shared this story in a sworn affidavit before he passed away. Testimony was provided by Ed Wilbert, another former employee of Dick's Cleaning Service who had frequented the Sheppard residence in 1954. Wilbert claimed that Marilyn would usually leave an outside basement door unlocked for the window washers, which could have provided a potential explanation for how Eberling went into the residence without any signs of forced entry. And even though Eberling had repeatedly said that he got along very well with Marilyn during his times visiting the house, Wilbert told a much different story and claimed that Marilyn had once caught Eberling stealing and disliked him. The Sheppard estate presented a previously withheld police report which mentioned that following the murder, a plaster impression had been made of some fresh pry marks on a basement door at the Sheppard residence. This information was not turned over to the defense at either of Sam's trials, even though it appeared to be potential evidence that an intruder had broken in. However, it turned out this door did not actually lead into the house, but was actually the door to a windowless crawl space, so this didn't seem to have much bearing on the case. Of course, one of the biggest arguments from the plaintiff was that the results of the recent DNA testing implicated Eberling and cleared Sam of any involvement in the murder, but DNA analysis was nowhere near as sophisticated in the year 2000 as it is today. Even though Dr. Mohammed Tahir took the stand to present his findings, the state argued that due to the handling of the blood evidence back in 1954, there was too much contamination for the results to have any value. James Neff would later say that he pushed forward the possibility of having DNA testing performed on two hairs which were found wrapped around Marilyn's left ring finger, as well as some of her fingernail scrapings. But in the end, neither side performed this testing, and it's been theorized that they were both paranoid about the results not going in their favor. The state also believed that some of the conclusions reached by Dr. Paul Leland Kirk during his original forensic analysis were inaccurate. Bart Epstein, a blood pattern analyst who had been a protege of Dr. Kirk, took the stand and concurred with Kirk's theory that the traces of blood found on the band of Sam's wristwatch had likely been the result of contact transfer and was not blood spatter. And while Epstein said he could not reach any conclusion about who killed Marilyn, he did not believe that Sam did it. As you recall, Kirk had determined that a blood spot found on the bedroom's closet door was a mixture of type O blood from two different people, Marilyn and her killer. Since Sam had type A blood, this seemed to lean away from him being the perpetrator, but Epstein was taken by complete surprise when Steve Deaver informed him on the witness stand that Richard Eberling also had type A blood. Needless to say, this dealt a major blow to the plaintiff's case that Eberling was responsible for the crime. Some of the other experts who testified at the trial rejected Kirk's original conclusion that the blood on the door belonged to two people, as back during the 1950s, there was no sound scientific method which could distinguish between two different samples of type O blood. While Dr. Tahir's recent DNA testing seemed to support the idea that the blood did belong to two people, this could have been the result of contamination. You also might recall that Dr. Kirk had concluded that the killer was left-handed, but much like Sam, Eberling was also right-handed. Cuyahoga County Coroner Dr. Elizabeth Balraj also testified that there was no scientific test available which could conclusively determine whether the fatal blows inflicted on Marilyn were delivered by a left-handed or right-handed person. Another expert who took the witness stand was Allegheny County Coroner Dr. Cyril Wecht, who was one of the most prominent forensic pathologists in the United States. Dr. Wecht had consulted on thousands of murder cases, many of which were domestic homicides, but he felt that Marilyn's murder did not fit that pattern and resembled a sexually motivated homicide instead. While Wecht agreed with Dr. Kirk's assessment that the killer was left-handed, one theory from Kirk which he did not agree with was that Marilyn's tooth had been broken when she bit her assailant, as he felt this was likely the result of blunt force trauma. Indeed, the consensus from most of the modern-day experts was that Marilyn did not bite her killer. One of these experts was Dr. Michael Sobel, a professor of dentistry at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Sobel was shown a photograph which had been taken of a scar that was on the underside of Richard Eberling's left wrist, and while he did not believe it was a bite mark, he said it could have been a scratch or gouge made by a fingernail, and that Marilyn managed to cut her assailant so deeply that he wound up dripping blood. Indeed, the nail on the fourth finger of Marilyn's left hand was partially broken, but Dr. Balraj testified that she did not believe this was a result of scratching or gouging someone, since those usually produce breaks on the top of the nail rather than the base. I just mentioned that Dr. Cyril Wecht believed that Marilyn's murder was a sexually motivated homicide, and prior to the trial, noted FBI criminal profiler John Douglas had performed his own analysis of the crime and reached the same conclusion. However, Greg McCrary, another retired FBI agent who analyzed crime scenes, provided his own expert testimony for the state and expressed his belief that Marilyn's murder was a domestic homicide which had been staged to look like a sex crime. The state also continued to pursue the theory that since Sam was treated at his family's hospital by his own brother Steve, the seriousness of his injuries had been greatly exaggerated. While the right side of Sam's face was undeniably swollen and bruised, the state always believed that these injuries were caused by Marilyn when she attempted to fight him off, while the so-called neck injuries he supposedly suffered had been faked. Expert testimony was provided by noted brain surgeon Dr. Robert White, who was also the director of the Division of Neurosurgery and the Brain Research Laboratory at the Metro Health Medical Center. Dr. White reviewed and analyzed Sam's original medical charts, which contained notes from Steve Sheppard and two other physicians who examined Sam. White pointed out that Steve described lacerations and abrasions in Sam's neck area, which were not mentioned by the other two physicians, and Steve seemed to categorize the injuries as being more serious than they did. One of Sam's charts described him as having a chip fracture in the second cervical vertebra and a bridging of the fifth and sixth vertebra, but White said that he had reviewed thousands of x-rays and had never seen an isolated chip fracture in the second vertebra before. After reviewing the charts, White said that he was unable to substantiate the original diagnosis of Sam having suffered a cerebral concussion. Dr. White also reviewed two separate sets of Sam's x-rays, the first of which was taken when he was admitted to the hospital on July 4th, 1954, and the second of which was taken 3 days later on July 7th. White felt that the two x-rays did not corroborate each other, as the condition of Sam's neck appeared to be much better on July 7th, and White did not believe it could have healed that well over the course of only 3 days. While this allegation was never proven, the implication seemed to be that Steve may have switched his brother's x-ray from July 4th with the x-ray of another patient who had a legitimate chip fracture in their neck. Even though Steve Sheppard was still alive by this point, he was never called upon to testify as a witness at the civil trial. Well, one important new witness who did testify was Marilyn's stepmother, Jane Reese, who was now 92 years old, and confirmed that both she and her late husband, Thomas, had always believed that Sam committed the crime. Jane claimed that following the murder, Sam's two brothers would not allow her or Thomas to see him at the hospital, and they were also unable to speak with Chip. Instead, the Reeses were directed to the home of Sam's parents, Richard Sr. and Ethel, who offered them tea and cookies and gave them a tour of their house, but behaved very oddly and seemed to be going out of their way to avoid talking about the murder. Jane also said that she received a phone call from Steve informing her about Marilyn's murder at 6 a.m. that morning, but the problem is that Steve supposedly did not learn about the murder until his sister-in-law Dorothy phoned him from Sam's residence at 6:08 a.m. Fred Drenkin, the first police officer who showed up at the crime scene, also testified at the civil trial and confirmed that Steve and his wife Betty first arrived there at around 6:20 a.m. However, Drenkin said that he always found it odd that the couple appeared to be freshly showered, well-groomed, and well-dressed, even though the drive from the residence in Rocky River would have taken approximately 12 minutes. So if Steve was woken up by the call at 6:08, when would the couple have found the time to shower? It also turned out that earlier that same morning, at around 4:30 a.m., some of Steve's neighbors had recalled seeing what appeared to be Steve's bright red Jaguar racing away from his home. The implication seemed to be that if Sam was guilty, he may have already phoned Steve and summoned him to the murder scene so they could work together to fabricate a cover story before contacting the police. Another new key witness was 80-year-old Paul Gerhardt, who happened to be the brother of Esther Houck. Gerhardt worked as a handyman and testified that in the days prior to the murder, Sam dropped off a lamp at his repair shop and asked him to replace the cord. Gerhardt said that he returned the lamp to the Sheppard residence on July the 2nd and that it was placed on a table between the twin beds in the guest bedroom. But by the time the murder took place, the lamp had seemingly gone missing, and Sam told Fred Drenkin that there had never been a lamp in that room. The state now believed that this lamp may have been the murder weapon Sam used to fatally bludgeon Marilyn before he disposed of it, and Steve Deaver even produced a lamp in the courtroom which he felt resembled the imprint on Marilyn's blood-stained pillow. For his part, even though Chip acknowledged that his parents had kept a lamp in the master bedroom, he did not recall a lamp ever having been in the guest bedroom, as the room's illumination came from a light fixture, and the Sheppard's former cleaning lady also had no recollection of a lamp being there. Anyway, the civil trial lasted for a total of 2 weeks before the case went to the 8-person jury on April the 12th. This time, they only had to deliberate for less than 5 hours before they returned a unanimous verdict in which they sided with the state of Ohio, as they did not believe the Sheppard estate had presented sufficient evidence to prove that Sam was wrongly convicted. In fact, during subsequent interviews, 6 of the 8 jurors stated that they believed Sam was guilty, and 2 of them even went so far as to say that if this had been a criminal trial, they would have given Sam the death penalty. The Sheppard estate appealed the verdict to the 8th District Court of Appeals for the state of Ohio, who affirmed the decision, and the Supreme Court of Ohio declined to review the case. In the years following the trial, 2 more books would be published about the Sheppard case. One of them was titled The Wrong Man, The Final Verdict on the Sam Sheppard Murder Case, and was written by James Neff, who concluded that Sam was wrongly convicted and Richard Eberling was likely the real killer. By contrast, prosecutor William Mason and author Jack Desario worked together to co-publish a book titled Dr. Sam Sheppard on Trial, Prosecutors and the Marilyn Sheppard Murder, in which they outlined their case for Sam's guilt and concluded that the verdict at the civil trial was the correct one. In April of 2002, a former FBI agent named Bernard Connors published a book titled Tailspin, The Strange Case of Major Call, which presented yet another potential suspect in the Sheppard murder, but I'm going to hold off on talking about this until our next episode. The conclusion of the civil trial pretty much brought an end to any sort of investigation into this crime, so after 70 years, debate still rages on about who was actually responsible for the murder of Marilyn Reese Sheppard. So, and I've been waiting 2 whole episodes to finally get to say this, but I guess you could say the trail went cold. So yes, folks, I'm going to have to leave you on yet another cliffhanger, but join me next week for part 3 as I share my theories and analysis and provide some further insight into this case. But if you have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the course of nearly 7 years, our Patreon page has released around 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released the audio of a panel session I participated in at the Berkshire Podcast Festival back in October, titled Life in True Crime, which was moderated by Josh Hallmark of the True Crime Bullshit podcast and featured yours truly discussing my life in true crime podcasting alongside Charlie from Crime Lines, Lainey from True Crime Cases, and Robert Palmer from the Broken System podcast. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discussed the 1979 murder of Deborah Jackson, a victim who was formerly an unidentified Jane Doe known only as Orange Socks. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 70 of these commentary tracks in archives. I'd also like to remind anyone that in just 1 month, The Trail Went Cold will be appearing at an event called AdvocacyCon, which is taking place from March the 28th to March the 30th at the Indianapolis Marriott East Hotel in Indianapolis, Indiana. It's being put together by fellow podcasters Eric from True Consequences and Melissa and Whitney from Navigating Advocacy, and is intended as a platform for the families of missing and murdered victims. We have a specialized promo code you can use to get a discount on tickets, so if you would like to attend, please visit their website, advocacycon.com, and use code TRAIL10 to get 10% off. Once again, the website is advocacycon.com, and the promo code is TRAIL10 for 10% off. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourself a great week and join us next Wednesday as we present Part 3 of our special 9-year anniversary show of The Trail Went Cold.